My name is Valentina. I'm 34. And last month I watched my supervisor accuse me of something I didn't do in front of the entire office. She said I was ruining her reputation, like I was some kind of threat. I felt the floor drop under me. One letter, just one letter, ended everything she tried to do to me. I'll tell you how it happened. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories about family drama, workplace betrayals, and emotion. I still remember the exact moment it happened. The moment everything in that office shifted from ordinary routine to something heavy, something sharp enough to cut through every bit of confidence I had. It started on a Thursday morning, the kind where nothing feels special. The air had the faint smell of burnt coffee grounds. The copier was doing that slow warming-up buzz, and people shuffled in with half-tucked shirts and tired eyes. It was a regular start to a regular workday, until it suddenly wasn't. I was settling into my desk, brushing crumbs off my keyboard from the pastry I ate in the car, when my supervisor, Erin, called everyone into the small conference room. She didn't ask. She didn't even look at me. She just said, "Team meeting." Now, her voice had this clipped edge that made a few people look up from their screens. I felt my stomach tug a little, though I couldn't explain why. The conference room was cramped, the kind with chairs that make a squeaking noise whenever someone shifts. I sat near the door. I always did. Not because I planned dramatic escapes, but because I never liked feeling trapped between people. Erin stood near the screen, folder in hand, jaw tight. She didn't bother with small talk or morning greetings. She went straight to the point, like she was ripping off a bandage. There was a serious error on the Davidson account, Erin said, and I need to make something clear. Her eyes moved around the room, but they didn't land on me at first. I thought she was going to explain a system glitch or give one of her usual reminders about accuracy. That's how she normally started meetings. But then her finger pointed straight at me. Valentina is the one responsible. For a second, I wasn't sure I heard right. The words echoed, responsible, 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 like someone dropped a stone into a well. I looked around. A few co-workers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes bouncing toward me, then away like they didn't want to get caught staring. My throat tightened. I don't understand, I said, my voice softer than I wanted. Erin's tone sharpened. You don't understand? The paperwork was mishandled. Notes were entered incorrectly. The client almost walked away from us. They called me directly. Do you know how embarrassing that is? Everyone stared at me now. It felt like a spotlight had been turned on, exposing every part of me. I tried to think back through the steps I took. I always double-checked entries. Always. I didn't handle the final update. I said, still trying to keep calm. You did that part. Erin's smile was thin, almost like she'd been waiting for me to say that. So now you're saying I'm lying? A small murmur went through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Another adjusted their glasses. No one said a word in my defense. Not yet. It was too early for anyone to choose sides. No one wants conflict at 9 in the morning. I felt the heat rise under my skin, but I kept my voice steady. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying I didn't enter that last. Well, she cut in, that's not what the system shows. Everyone looked at the screen. I looked too, but the document she pulled up wasn't the final one. It was an older draft with my initials on it. She chose it on purpose. She had to. My fingers trembled under the table where no one could see. I felt my heart beating in my throat, loud and uneven. I'd never been framed before, not at work, not anywhere, and it felt like my body didn't know how to react. Shock mixed with confusion. Confusion mixed with disbelief. And disbelief mixed with something darker, fear. Because I knew right then that Erin had decided to make me her target. After the meeting ended, People avoided eye contact, like I was carrying something contagious. I walked back to my desk, feeling every step. My inbox already had 2 emails from coworkers asking if everything was okay, but in that cautious tone people use when they don't want to take sides. I stared at my monitor, but the screen blurred. I tried to replay the whole meeting in my head, trying to figure out what set Aaron off. Why me? Why now? I'd worked there for 4 years. I'd never caused trouble, never argued with anyone, never missed a deadline. I was the kind of employee managers like to brag about in annual reviews. Reliable, steady, easy to work with. But now I felt like I'd become a problem she wanted to erase. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Office gossip moves fast, faster than any memo or policy update. People walk a little slower near your desk when you're the subject of interest. They pretend they're grabbing something from the printer when really they're trying to hear if you're upset, if you're angry, if you're crying. I tried to ignore it. I kept my head down, fingers tapping softly against the keyboard, even though I wasn't typing anything meaningful. My mind was spinning too much to work. Around lunch, I finally built the courage to talk to Erin. I approached her office with steady breaths, trying to appear calm even though my insides felt unsettled. "Do you have a minute?" She didn't look up. "Not really." "It's important." She sighed dramatically, then gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Fine. Make it quick." I sat. The chair let out a faint squeak that sounded too loud in that quiet space. Erin folded her arms, leaning back slightly, her expression somewhere between impatience and annoyance. "I need to understand what happened this morning," I said, "because I didn't mishandle that account." Erin shrugged. "Well, someone has to take responsibility." I blinked. "And you chose me?" She raised an eyebrow, like she couldn't believe I'd question her. "If you were more careful, this wouldn't have happened. You've been slipping lately. People see it." Slipping? That wasn't true. And people? Who were these so-called people? I wanted to push back harder, but something in her face told me it wouldn't matter. She'd already made up her mind. But what she said next changed everything. "You're starting to affect my reputation," she said quietly, leaning in. "I can't have that." There it was. The real reason. Not the account. Not the paperwork. Her image. Her ego. She cared more about her reputation than the truth. I left her office feeling small, confused, but also strangely alert, like my instincts had woken up from a long sleep. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She was protecting something bigger than a simple mistake. That afternoon, something happened that seemed minor at first, but ended up becoming important later. I went to refill my water bottle in the break room, and as I rounded the corner, 2 coworkers, Maddie and Paul, stopped talking mid-sentence. They looked at me, startled, then looked down at their lunches like they were caught doing something wrong. I walked to the water dispenser, pretending not to notice, but I heard the tail end of their whispered conversation. She said Valentina's been slipping up for months. Months? That wasn't true. But it meant one thing. Erin had been talking about me long before today. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't heat of the moment blame. This was planned, and I had no idea why. The rest of the day passed in a haze. People kept their distance. Erin stayed locked in her office. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I clicked into a document, the words blurred. I left work feeling drained, like something heavy had attached itself between my shoulder blades. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table without turning on the lights. The house felt too quiet, like the silence was studying me. I went through every memory I had of Erin, every friendly exchange, every meeting, every conversation. Nothing explained why she'd suddenly turned against me. Nothing. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. At around 2 in the morning, I finally got up and opened my laptop. I looked through old work emails, old notes, old project files. A part of me hoped I'd find some small clue, some forgotten detail. Instead, I found something else entirely. A letter. Not a digital letter. A scanned copy of a handwritten one. I didn't open it that night. I don't know why. Maybe I was too exhausted. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Maybe some part of me knew that once I opened it, everything would change. So I closed the laptop gently and forced myself to breathe. But one thought lingered as I lay in bed watching the shadows on my ceiling. If Erin was willing to blame me in front of the entire office, what was she so desperate to hide? And why did she think I could ruin her reputation, unless she'd already done something that could destroy it herself? I fell asleep eventually, but with a heaviness that pressed deep into my chest. I didn't know it then, but that single moment, Erin pointing her finger at me, was the start of something far bigger than a workplace misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a truth she never expected to surface. And the letter I hadn't opened yet, that letter would become the only thing powerful enough to bring her silence. The next morning, I walked into the office and immediately felt a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, a silence heavier than usual, a few chairs left slightly ajar as if people had left in a hurry, but enough to make my skin crawl. The hum of computers was slower, more cautious, and even the air conditioning seemed colder. My footsteps echoed against the tile floor as I approached my desk. And for the first time, I noticed the absence of casual greetings or nods from my coworkers. No "good morning, Valentina," no smile from the receptionist, not even the faint acknowledgement from the janitor, who usually winked when I passed by. I sat down slowly, pulling open my email, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Yet the moment I glanced up, I saw Paul from accounting staring at me from across the room. His posture stiffened, and he quickly turned away the second our eyes met. Maddie, who usually brought extra granola bars for everyone, walked past my desk with her head down, barely acknowledging me. It was like the office had transformed overnight into a place where I no longer belonged. By mid-morning, the whispers started. At first, it was just snippets. "Did you hear what happened with Valentina? I don't know if she's really reliable." And then the murmur grew, spreading slowly like ink in water. The words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to make me flinch every time I passed a group of coworkers huddled near the copier or the water cooler. I realized quickly that Erin had planted the seeds. She wasn't just blaming me. She was isolating me, making sure the office would question every move I made. During the first coffee break, I tried to approach someone friendly, Mark, who had been in the office longer than anyone. "Hey, Mark, do you have a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded politely, but hesitated before speaking. "Valentina, look, I don't know the full story," he said cautiously, glancing over his shoulder. I guess things got messy with that Davidson account. Erin mentioned you were involved." I felt the hot sting of betrayal in my chest. "Involved?" I asked, trying not to let my voice crack. "Mark, I didn't make the error. You know that." Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know, but, Erin. People are scared to question her. She said it's affecting her reputation." That one phrase, affecting her reputation, hit me harder than any accusation could. I realized that the problem wasn't just the error itself. It was her image she was protecting, and I was being positioned as the scapegoat. By lunchtime, I noticed another change. Emails were becoming strangely formal. A coworker who normally sent a quick, friendly, "Can you look over this?" suddenly typed messages with cold precision, CCing multiple managers. Every response felt like it was crafted to distance themselves from me, as if a single word of friendliness might taint their reputation by association. I tried to focus on my work, but every click of the mouse, every spreadsheet I opened felt like a spotlight on my mistakes. My heart raced each time Erin walked past my desk, her eyes flicking toward mine, a small smirk tugging at her lips. I felt watched, judged, and trapped simultaneously. The office that once felt safe, even mundane, now felt like a courtroom. Later that afternoon, HR called me in for a routine check-in. I walked through the corridors, each step heavier than the last, and the fluorescent lights above seemed harsher, glaring down like they were exposing every tiny flaw. When I arrived, the HR manager, Diane, gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Valentina," Diane said gently, "I just want to get your perspective on the Davidson account." Erin mentioned some concerns. I swallowed hard, forcing calm. "I'm happy to explain. I didn't handle the final entry on that account, and all my notes and communications are time-stamped." Diane nodded, flipping through a folder of documents. "I see, but Erin feels it's a pattern, that there's been slipping attention in your work recently. Have you noticed any challenges?" I shook my head. "Not at all. I've been consistent. Everything I submit is cross-checked." She looked thoughtful, almost sympathetic. "Well, it's delicate. Erin's worried about how this reflects on the team. Sometimes it's hard to separate perception from reality in situations like these." Perception from her? The thought gnawed at me. This wasn't just about work anymore. It was about control, about shaping a story where I appeared to be the villain. And, apparently, the office was already buying into it. Back at my desk, the coldness didn't relent. People would barely acknowledge my presence. Even the small, casual interactions, once warm, now clipped. Maddie passed my cubicle with a plate of sandwiches, but she didn't offer one. Paul, who usually joked about the printer, always jamming, avoided my section entirely. I realized that Erin's manipulation wasn't loud. It was subtle, quiet, creeping in through the way people looked at me, the words they didn't say, the lunches I didn't get invited to. That evening, I overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I was walking past the supply closet when I heard two coworkers talking in low tones. "I don't know. Erin said Valentina is a liability now. I don't want to get involved." One whispered. The other nodded. "Yeah, it's weird. I liked her before. But, it's easier to stay on Erin's side." I froze in the hallway, my chest tightening. This wasn't just professional caution. It was fear. Erin had turned my coworkers into allies of her story, or at least convinced them it was safer to pretend I was the problem. My throat burned, and I wanted to scream, to tell them all the truth, but who would believe me when Erin had already narrated the story her way? The next day, I noticed something even stranger. People started leaving my work unfinished in shared spaces, as if subtly undermining me. A spreadsheet I had meticulously updated was changed, small errors introduced that only I would catch. And whenever I approached someone to ask about it, they would glance nervously at Erin's office and mumble excuses, avoiding eye contact. The office had become a maze of suspicion, isolation, and quiet sabotage. By the end of the week, even the office meetings felt different. Erin spoke louder, more authoritatively, casting glances at me as she laid out the team's agenda. Every word she said seemed carefully calculated to remind everyone of her competence and to reinforce the notion that I was the weak link. I tried to contribute, but every suggestion I made was ignored or subtly dismissed. Comments like, "Interesting, but let's circle back to Erin's recommendation," were layered in a way that made me feel small, almost invisible. I began keeping a small notebook during this time. I wrote down interactions, emails, whispers, anything that seemed relevant. At first, it felt like overkill, paranoid even, but as I documented the unfolding pattern, I realized it was necessary. The office had turned cold, yes, but it wasn't just temperature or attitude. It was a calculated social maneuver designed to isolate me, to erode my confidence until I would crumble under pressure. One afternoon, a surprising moment of humanity broke through the frost. Jason, the IT guy, passed my cubicle with a cup of coffee. Heard about the Davidson thing. He said, quietly, "I just want you to know, I don't think it was your fault." It was a small gesture, almost meaningless in the grand scale of the office chill, but it made me realize something important. Not everyone was brainwashed by Aaron's narrative. Some people still saw the truth, even if they didn't have the courage to say it aloud. That thought gave me a thread of hope in the suffocating environment. Still, that thread was thin. Later that week, I discovered another subtle attack. Someone had left a note on my desk. Not a threatening note, just a sticky that read, "Careful with your work. Reputation matters." The handwriting was neat, anonymous, a passive warning, a reminder that Erin's influence had spread beyond her office walls. I crumpled it in my hand, frustrated and exhausted. My workplace, which had once felt like a second home, now resembled a minefield, and I was navigating it blindly. By Friday, the coldness had reached every corner of the office. Lunchtime became an isolating exercise in self-control. People ate together, huddled in corners, while I sat alone at my desk, pretending to read emails but actually tracking movements, conversations, and behaviors. I began noticing patterns. Who always glanced at Erin before speaking, who avoided the central hallways, who lingered just long enough to give an appearance of politeness before retreating. Each observation reinforced the realization that Erin wasn't just targeting me, she was orchestrating a social environment to reinforce her story. That night, I stayed late to finish reports, listening to the echoes of my footsteps in empty hallways. The office lights cast sharp shadows, making every corner look more menacing than it was. I felt a strange combination of exhaustion, rage, and determination. I realized something. The office could be cold and silent all it wanted, but I wasn't powerless. The isolation, the whispers, the emails, the subtle undermining, it all painted a clear picture. Erin was trying to control the narrative, but I could see the pattern. And once I had clarity, I understood that coldness could be met with quiet strategy. As I locked my desk and walked toward the exit, I passed Erin's office. She was on the phone, speaking animatedly, smiling as if nothing had happened. Yet I noticed the small crease at the corner of her mouth, the twitch in her fingers. Maybe, just maybe, the storm I was quietly preparing would reach her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Walking to my car, the crisp evening air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. I knew the office had turned cold, but I also knew that I wasn't the one frozen. I wasn't broken. And in that quiet realization, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in days: control. For the first time, I considered the letter I had tucked away, the one Erin never expected me to have, the one that, if revealed correctly, could shift the narrative entirely. But for now, I focused on endurance, observation, and subtle moves. The office may have turned cold, but I was ready to navigate it, and I wasn't going to let their whispers define me. And so began the slow, careful navigation of a workplace that had turned against me, an environment colder than the winter air outside, yet one I intended to survive, and ultimately the quiet realization that I had survived the day. The whispers, the cold stares, the deliberate silences gave me a small spark of hope. But that spark was tangled with unease. Erin's control over the office had not lessened. It had only shifted into subtler currents, nudging everyone into positions where they avoided me without even knowing why. That's when my thoughts returned to the letter, the one I never planned to use. I had discovered it months ago, buried deep in a drawer of old documents I was clearing from my desk. It had been a file of miscellaneous notes and reminders Aaron had left, the kind of careless collection most of us tossed aside without a second glance. But among the scribbled lines, there was one folded page, written in neat, precise handwriting. I had almost ignored it until I unfolded it and read the words. Aaron had asked me, months before the Davidson incident, to cover up an error she made on a smaller client account. She explained it carefully, almost apologetically, as though she trusted me completely. "Please, Valentina, just handle this quietly," she had written. "I don't want anyone to know. This could affect my standing if it gets out." At the time, I had folded the letter back, tucking it away in my drawer. I hadn't used it because I didn't want to betray her trust. I had believed in professionalism, in loyalty, even if the request felt unfair. I thought of it as a private office matter, one of those small compromises that everyone occasionally makes to keep things running smoothly. I never imagined it would resurface, and certainly never imagined it would become a weapon in a silent war. Now, with the office cold and my reputation under siege, that same letter took on a new weight. It was no longer just a memory of her misplaced trust. It was proof that Aaron had been manipulating situations for her own benefit, proof that she had knowingly involved me in her mistakes, and proof that she could no longer claim ignorance. The problem was that using it felt dangerous. Using it meant crossing a line I had never crossed before. It meant showing the truth in a way that could change everything, perhaps even backfire. For the next few days, I wrestled with the idea. I carried the folded letter in my bag, pulling it out at odd moments, staring at Aaron's handwriting. Every time I did, my stomach twisted with tension. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to demand that she acknowledge the truth. But another part, my careful, cautious part, warned me that timing and strategy mattered. A hasty move could destroy my credibility entirely. While the office continued its slow, cold drift away from me, I started paying closer attention to patterns and interactions. Aaron's influence was subtle, like threads in a spiderweb, pulling coworkers into her narrative without them realizing it. Emails became indirect, polite yet distant. Meetings felt like arenas where every word I spoke was scrutinized for signs of weakness. Even casual hallway greetings were avoided by those who previously had smiled at me. And everywhere I looked, Erin seemed composed, untouchable, her reputation pristine in the eyes of everyone except me. It was during one of these quiet, tense days that I discovered something else, a small discrepancy in a report. The Davidson account had been audited internally for another reason, and a minor error had been flagged. I realized immediately that it was the same error Aaron had asked me to handle months ago. My mind raced. This wasn't coincidence. The letter wasn't just relevant. It was central to proving the narrative she was constructing. I kept the letter with me, sliding it into a folder of documents I brought to meetings. Every glance at it made my pulse quicken, a mixture of fear, anger, and anticipation. I knew I had to be careful. If I revealed it too early, it would look like I was attacking her personally, like I was overreacting to gossip and office politics. If I waited too long, her influence might deepen, making the office even colder and more hostile. Timing was everything. One afternoon, I received an email from Diane in HR requesting a brief clarification meeting about workflow processes. My heart sank. It was always the euphemistic tone, polite, neutral, but carrying weight. I arrived in her office to find her reviewing a small stack of papers, her expression serious but not unkind. "Valentina," she said softly, "I want to make sure everything is clear regarding the Davidson account. There are concerns Aaron raised. We just need your side documented." I nodded, trying to stay composed. Of course, I have records of every step I took, including emails and timestamp notes. I can show you exactly what I did. Diane took the papers, flipping through them carefully. I appreciate that. And I want to make sure we're fair. Erin has raised points about process, but we also need to make sure any oversight is fully understood. Her words reminded me of the letter tucked safely in my bag. It felt heavier now, almost like a physical presence demanding attention. I debated whether to bring it up, whether to reveal it during this meeting, but the rational part of me resisted. I needed a plan, not a panic move. That evening, alone at my apartment, I unfolded the letter again. The handwriting was meticulous, almost painfully neat. Erin had spelled out exactly what she needed me to do: cover up an error, submit corrected documents, and ensure that no one discovered her oversight. Reading it now, after the office had turned against me, I felt a mix of emotions: betrayal, validation, and a sharp sense of justice waiting to be claimed. I realized I had underestimated its power. At the time of discovery, it had seemed like a simple note of office politics. Now it was evidence. It was a key to reclaiming my agency, my credibility, and my peace of mind. But using it would be a choice, a deliberate, irreversible choice. Over the next few days, I started observing Erin more closely. I watched her interactions, noting the small manipulations she executed effortlessly. A raised eyebrow here, a subtle correction there, a soft phrase whispered to a coworker that could seed doubt. She wasn't careless. She was meticulous, deliberate, and her influence over the office was precise. I realized that to reveal the letter successfully, I had to match her careful orchestration with my own strategic approach. One day, Erin left her office briefly to attend a client call. I sat quietly, folding and unfolding the letter in my hands, imagining the confrontation. I rehearsed words in my head: calm, factual, unprovocative. No shouting, no accusations, just facts, just proof, just her own words. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. And I knew that if I executed it correctly, it would speak louder than any confrontation or argument. Meanwhile, the office continued its cold drift. Emails became clipped, interactions remained tense, and even my closest allies at work hesitated to speak openly. The weight of isolation sharpened my resolve. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was reclaiming my narrative one step at a time. During a quiet lunch break, Maddie finally spoke to me. She slid a sandwich across my desk and whispered, "I don't know why everyone's being so distant. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I smiled faintly, accepting the gesture. "Thanks, Maddie. I appreciate it." She hesitated, then added, "I think maybe there's more to this than we see. Erin's not always straightforward." That tiny spark of acknowledgement reminded me why the letter mattered. Not only could it prove my innocence, it could illuminate the truth for others, restore fairness, and expose the subtle web Erin had woven around the office. Over the next week, I meticulously prepared. I organized emails, cross-referenced records, and ensured the letter was accessible but secure. Every interaction, every document, every subtle observation about Erin's manipulation became a piece of a puzzle I was assembling with deliberate care. I felt an unexpected calm growing inside me, a quiet confidence I hadn't realized I possessed. One evening, I left the office later than usual, carrying the folder with the letter tucked neatly inside. The halls were empty, the fluorescent lights casting long, angular shadows that stretched like fingers across the tiles. I paused, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about one letter or one accusation. It was about truth, fairness, and the ability to reclaim control in an environment that had systematically stripped it from me. As I walked toward my car, I realized that the letter had transformed in my mind. It was no longer a simple piece of paper. It was my shield, my voice, my silent ally in a world that had suddenly turned against me. And when the time came to use it, I would do so not out of anger, but out of necessity, with calm precision. For the first time in days, I felt a measure of peace. The office could be cold, the whispers sharp, and Aaron's manipulations subtle, but I had the letter, and with it, I had power. Power not to humiliate, not to retaliate unnecessarily, but to expose the truth in a way that words alone could never achieve. And so, with that letter safely in my possession, I began the careful, deliberate planning of my next steps. Each day, I observed, documented, and strategized. I learned patience. I learned precision. And most importantly, I learned that sometimes the most potent weapon is not confrontation, but evidence carefully wielded in the right moment. I didn't know exactly when that moment would come, but I knew it was coming. The morning of the meeting, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. I knew the letter was with me, carefully folded and tucked in my folder, but I also knew that simply possessing it wouldn't resolve anything. I had to be deliberate, patient, and calm. The office air was unusually still that day, as if the fluorescent lights themselves were holding their breath. Erin's presence in her office was commanding, yet there was a subtle tension I hadn't noticed before. Something had shifted in her demeanor, an edge of uncertainty lurking beneath her polished exterior. Diane from HR called me into the small conference room just after 10. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a mix that usually put me on edge. I could feel the weight of the day pressing down on me, and yet, as I walked toward the meeting, my steps felt heavier than usual, not from fear, but from the burden of truth I carried in my folder. Erin was already seated at the conference table when I arrived. Her posture was rigid, the kind that tries to project control, even when internal currents of stress swirl beneath the surface. She smiled as I sat down, but it was a controlled, calculated smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Valentina," she said, her tone casual but with a subtle edge, "thanks for coming in. I wanted to clear the air." I nodded, folding my hands neatly on the table. "Of course," I said softly. My voice was steady, but inside, my pulse raced. Every muscle in my body was tuned to the moment, the anticipation, the stakes, the weight of the letter that could change everything. Erin leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "I want to talk about the Davidson account situation," she began, her eyes flicking toward Diane as if seeking silent support. "There's been some confusion. I just want to understand what happened, from your perspective." I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch long enough for the weight of my words to sink in. "I can explain," I said quietly. "I didn't handle the final update on that account. My notes and records show the sequence clearly, and I want to be transparent. Everything is documented." Her expression didn't falter. If anything, her smile sharpened. "I know you have records," she said smoothly, "but people saw the final entry, Valentina. People assumed." She let her voice trail, letting the implication hang like a shadow over the table. I felt my jaw tighten, but I forced myself to remain composed. The moment had come. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my folder and retrieved the letter. I placed it in the center of the table, letting it rest between us like a silent, undeniable witness. Erin's eyes flicked to it almost immediately. Her smile faltered for the briefest of moments, a subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth that betrayed something beneath her controlled surface. She leaned forward slightly, trying to mask her reaction with a cough. I didn't speak right away. I let her read it first. The words were hers, neatly written, direct, and precise. Please, Valentina, just handle this quietly, she had written. I don't want anyone to know. This could affect my standing if it gets out. I watched her face as she read, noting the slight paling around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Every line, every crease seemed to sharpen in response to her own words. It was surreal watching someone confronted by their own truth without uttering a single sound. Do you remember this? I finally asked, my voice calm but firm. This is from months ago. You asked me to cover an error, to ensure no one found out. You trusted me with something serious. And now, when a bigger issue arises, you're blaming me instead. Her hand trembled ever so slightly as she picked up the letter and smoothed it against her folder. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Words didn't come. For the first time in months, Erin was silent. Diane shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. Erin, I think this explains some of the confusion. Valentina has documentation, and now this letter confirms her version of events. We need to review everything fair. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room. Erin's carefully constructed narrative, the one she had spent weeks shaping, unraveled quietly in the presence of one small, folded sheet of paper. The silence was deafening, heavy, and undeniable. Finally, Erin spoke, her voice lower, tight. I didn't. You did, I said softly, leaning back in my chair. You involved me in your mistake. And then, when it became inconvenient, you accused me publicly and manipulated the office against me. This letter proves your own words, Erin, not mine. Her face flushed, and for the first time, I saw fear. Not fear of me personally, but fear of exposure, fear of consequence. Every carefully maintained piece of her office persona, the authority, the calm, the untouchable control, was cracking, and she couldn't stop it. The meeting stretched on, not with shouting or confrontation, but with the quiet power of truth. Diane reviewed the letter, cross-checked it with Valentina's documentation, and slowly, systematically, the narrative shifted. Erin's earlier accusations began to collapse under the weight of her own admissions, and I felt a strange, almost surreal satisfaction, not from revenge, but from justice finally finding its footing. Erin tried to regain control, interjecting occasionally, her words carefully measured, almost pleading. I didn't mean. It doesn't matter what you meant, I said calmly. It matters what you did and what you wrote. The letter is clear. Your actions, your instructions, your request for secrecy, everything is documented. The tension in the room was palpable. Erin's lips pressed tightly together, her knuckles white against the edge of the table. Diane maintained her neutral composure, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, ensuring that everything was recorded accurately. I sat back, letting the moment unfold. It wasn't about triumph. It was about truth, finally emerging unfiltered. After what felt like an eternity, Erin's shoulders slumped slightly. She leaned back, exhaling through her nose in a slow, defeated sigh. Silence enveloped the room once more. Not the cold, manipulative silence of the office. It was a different kind, heavy with acknowledgement and the quiet weight of accountability. Diane looked between us, her voice gentle but firm. Erin, based on the documentation and this letter, we need to review the situation carefully. Valentina's position is clear, and your role in the prior handling of the account will be noted. We'll take the necessary steps to ensure fairness moving forward. Erin didn't argue. She just nodded faintly, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that the room's balance had shifted. I felt a release deep inside me, a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying for weeks. The office that had been cold, isolating, and manipulative had finally been confronted, not through confrontation alone, but through undeniable, calm truth. And for the first time since the accusations began, I felt my confidence return. not arrogantly, not vindicatively, but with quiet clarity. When the meeting ended, I left the conference room slowly, my hands folded over my folder. Aaron stayed behind, still processing the weight of the moment, while Diane offered a reassuring glance. The hallway outside felt lighter, almost warmer. The office's coldness hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. A subtle balance had returned, one rooted not in fear or whispers, but in honesty and accountability. As I walked back to my desk, coworkers passed by, some nodding quietly, others offering tentative smiles. It was different now. There was an awareness in their eyes, a recognition that the story I had been silent about for so long was real. Aaron's subtle influence still lingered, but it no longer held the same unquestionable power. Sitting at my desk, I unfolded the letter one last time. I didn't need it anymore to assert my position. It had done its work. Yet I couldn't bring myself to fold it away. Not yet. It felt like a marker of what had changed, a silent reminder of how power, manipulation, and truth intersected in ways that weren't always loud or dramatic. That evening, I stayed late organizing my notes and reviewing documentation, but my mind wasn't consumed by fear or anxiety anymore. I reflected on the quiet strength it had taken to remain composed, to wait for the right moment, and to allow the truth to speak. The meeting hadn't just resolved the immediate conflict, it had changed my perception of myself and my agency. I had realized that subtle, calculated action, combined with patience and preparation, could accomplish more than confrontation or shouting ever could. By the time I left the office, the corridors seemed different. Shadows were still long, the fluorescent lights still harsh, but the energy was lighter, less oppressive. The quiet meeting had shifted more than just the narrative. It had shifted the atmosphere. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a cautious optimism about the days to come. That night, I placed the letter carefully in my drawer, not as a weapon, but as a testament. A quiet meeting had changed everything, not by shouting, not by force, but by demonstrating that truth, once properly presented, has a power that no manipulation or whisper campaign can override. And I knew deep down that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just in my workplace, but in my understanding of patience, strategy, and the quiet, enduring strength that comes from standing firmly. The day after the quiet meeting, the office felt different, yet eerily calm. There were no whispers, no cold stares, and no subtle nudges of gossip in hallways. It was as if the world had collectively paused, waiting for something to unfold that in reality had already happened. Erin's presence remained at her desk, but the aura of untouchability she carried for so long was gone. She moved through the office with a slower, more calculated rhythm, and I realized that her silence was now louder than any confrontation could have been. That morning, I arrived early, coffee in hand, my folder tucked neatly under my arm. The light filtering through the blinds made the office feel almost warm for the first time in weeks. I noticed small things I hadn't before. The way the plants near the reception area seemed perkier, the faint hum of the heating system, even the soft clatter of the coffee machine in the break room. These minor details, once overlooked, now felt like signs of life returning, subtle affirmations that the world hadn't ended with the office drama. I approached my desk cautiously, half expecting someone to pass a sideways glance or murmur behind their hands. But the space around me was undisturbed, almost serene. Mark passed by and offered a small nod, not the hesitant, fearful nod from before, but one of acknowledgement. Maddie stopped briefly to drop off a cup of tea, smiling without hesitation. Even Jason, who had always been quiet, caught my eye and gave me a brief thumbs up. The office had shifted from icy isolation to cautious acknowledgement, and the change was tangible. Erin, however, remained silent. She didn't approach me, didn't offer explanations, didn't attempt to salvage her fractured image. Her silence was deliberate, almost punitive, yet strangely liberating. For weeks, I had imagined confrontation that would be loud, dramatic, or even vindictive. But silence, her quiet, unresolved, unspoken acknowledgement, was far more powerful. It required no words to confirm what I already knew. The balance of truth had shifted, and I no longer needed her validation to feel justified. By mid-morning, I began to notice subtle reactions across the office. Colleagues who had previously avoided my gaze now offered casual smiles or brief exchanges. Small, seemingly insignificant interactions, someone passing a pen, a quiet question about a report, felt monumental. Each gesture reminded me that the story I had been defending, the truth I had fought to preserve, was finally recognized, not because I demanded it, but because the evidence spoke for itself. I spent some time reviewing my notes, emails, and the carefully documented timeline of events surrounding the Davidson account. As I organized them, I realized something profound. The letter had been more than a tool for vindication. It had been a catalyst, a reminder that patience, careful planning, and unwavering adherence to truth could triumph over manipulation and fear. The moment Aaron remained silent, the room itself seemed to acknowledge that fact, as if the walls were finally aligned with justice rather than gossip. During lunch, I sat at my desk, quietly, half eating a sandwich, observing the subtle shifts around me. Aaron remained at her office, typing occasionally, but never glancing in my direction. Her silence had become a statement, louder than anything she could have said in defense or denial. It was both an admission and a retreat, a tacit acknowledgement of her own role in the previous tension. I realized in that moment that closure often doesn't come from loud victories or explosive confrontations. Sometimes it comes from the quiet, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that truth cannot be denied. Later, Diane from HR stopped by my desk. "Valentina, I just wanted to check in," she said softly, her eyes warm. "I know the situation has been difficult, but I want you to know that the documentation you provided, along with the letter, has clarified everything. You handled this with professionalism and patience." Her words washed over me like a gentle tide, calming the residual anxiety that had gripped me for weeks. "Thank you, Diane," I said, my voice steady but full of relief. "I just wanted the truth to be known. That's all." As she left, I noticed Erin through the glass wall of her office. She wasn't looking at me, wasn't making a move, just sitting with her fingers interlaced, staring down at her keyboard. Her silence felt heavier than any accusation, yet paradoxically it was freeing. It no longer mattered what she thought, how she maneuvered, or whether she acknowledged me verbally. The truth had been established, and the rest was simply her choice. Over the next few days, the office atmosphere continued to improve. People who had avoided me slowly began to interact naturally. Meetings were more balanced, conversations were no longer laced with judgment, and the quiet tension that had hung like a fog gradually lifted. I realized that Aaron's silence had a ripple effect. It gave others the space to observe reality without fear of reprisal, and in doing so, it restored a sense of fairness across the team. One afternoon, I found myself lingering near the coffee machine, watching Aaron walk past. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, but there was a subtle shift in her posture. She wasn't defeated, but she was no longer untouchable. That moment struck me with a strange clarity. Closure wasn't about punishing her or seeking revenge. Closure was about reclaiming my own peace, reclaiming my dignity, and allowing the consequences of truth to unfold naturally. I began to focus on my own work with renewed energy. The Davidson account was no longer a source of tension, but a reminder of what I had endured and overcome. Each report I completed, each email I sent carried a quiet confidence that had been absent before. I felt lighter, more in control, and strangely invigorated by the realization that patience and integrity could withstand even the most calculated manipulation. During one quiet afternoon, Maddie approached my desk, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I think things are finally settling," she said with a soft smile. "People are starting to see that you were right all along." I accepted the coffee gratefully. "It feels surreal," I admitted. I expected confrontation, drama, maybe even more conflict. But it's this quiet acknowledgement, this calm, it's more powerful than I imagined. She nodded, understanding. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. People notice things eventually, even if it takes time. That simple exchange resonated deeply. I realized that Erin's silence had not only validated my own position, but had also allowed others to see the truth for themselves. The impact was subtle but enduring, a lesson in patience, strategy, and the quiet power of unspoken truth. As the week drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the journey from accusation to closure. The cold office, the whispered gossip, the subtle manipulations, all of it had tested my resolve, my patience, and my ability to remain composed under pressure. Yet, in the end, the letter, the documentation, and the quiet confrontation in the conference room had shifted the balance. Erin's silence had become a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of her own actions without my intervention. I realized that closure often comes in unexpected forms. It doesn't always arrive with dramatic gestures or loud vindications. Sometimes it arrives as quiet acknowledgement, as subtle shifts in behavior, as the slow, deliberate recognition that truth cannot be denied. Erin's silence had become my closure because it was the final, undeniable proof that the narrative she had tried to control no longer held power over me. That evening, as I packed up my things and prepared to leave the office, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in weeks. The fluorescent lights, once harsh and oppressive, now seemed neutral, almost comforting. The echoes of footsteps in the empty hallway were no longer ominous, but grounding. The office had returned to a place of work, of collaboration, and of fairness, and I had regained my place within it, not through confrontation, but through patience, truth, and the quiet impact of undeniable evidence. Walking to my car, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The city felt alive, vibrant, and open in a way that mirrored my own inner state. The tension, fear, and isolation that had dominated my days had finally lifted, replaced by clarity, calm, and a renewed sense of purpose. In the days that followed, Erin remained quiet, respectful, but distant. She never apologized, never acknowledged the letter verbally, and never attempted to manipulate the office again. Her silence was complete, and in that completeness, I found the final piece of my peace. It was as if the universe had handed me the resolution I had been seeking, not through conflict or drama, but through the quiet acknowledgement that actions have consequences and truth endures. By the time I looked back at the week's events, I understood something essential. Closure is personal. It doesn't require the other person to speak, apologize, or admit guilt. It simply requires the recognition that you have acted with integrity, patience, and courage, and that, in itself, is enough. Erin's silence had given me that recognition, and in doing so, it had freed me from the weight of anger, frustration, and doubt. That night, as I placed the letter back in my drawer, I did so with gratitude rather than resentment. It had served its purpose, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a guidepost, a reminder of what careful patience and unwavering adherence to truth could achieve. I knew that I would carry the lessons of that experience with me for years to come, lessons about patience, strategy, the quiet power of evidence, and the liberating strength found in someone else's silence. And so, in the quiet aftermath, I found my closure, not in confrontation, not in vindication, but in the stillness, in the recognition of truth, and in the profound understanding that some battles are won not with noise or fury, but with patience, integrity, and the calm knowledge that silence, when wielded correctly, can speak louder than any words. As I walked out of the office that final evening, the weight that had pressed down on me for weeks, maybe even months, finally lifted. The fluorescent lights no longer seemed harsh. The echoes of my own footsteps in the empty hallways felt steady, grounding, almost like a heartbeat reaffirming that I was still in control of my own story. Aaron's silence had become more than a resolution. It had become a mirror reflecting everything I had endured, everything I had proven, and everything I had survived. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no apologies, no proclamations of guilt, no explosive confrontations. It was quiet, subtle, undeniable, and in that quiet, I found an unexpected liberation. I realized then that closure is rarely about forcing someone to admit wrongdoing or to seek forgiveness. Closure, I had learned, is about reclaiming your own sense of peace, your dignity, and your voice, even if the person who caused the turmoil never acknowledges it directly. Erin's silence spoke volumes, louder than any words she could have uttered. It acknowledged her own manipulation and subtly confirmed my patience, my perseverance, and my commitment to truth. And in witnessing that, I no longer felt the need to prove anything further. The office that had been cold and isolating slowly began to feel normal again. Colleagues who had once averted their eyes now greeted me with subtle smiles. Conversations were lighter, less tense, and I noticed small acts of kindness and acknowledgement that had previously been absent. I could sense the shift in energy, the gradual restoration of fairness and balance, and it felt as if the space itself was breathing easier, now aligned with honesty rather than whispers and unspoken accusations. More importantly, I had shifted internally. I no longer defined myself by the false narratives others had tried to impose on me, nor by the anxiety and fear that Erin's manipulation had once generated. I had discovered a quiet but powerful truth that integrity, patience, and careful observation are often stronger than immediate confrontation, that justice doesn't always need to be loud to be effective, and that personal strength is measured not by how loudly you fight, but by how steadfastly you hold to what you know is right. Holding the letter one last time, I placed it gently in my drawer, a symbol of endurance, proof, and triumph, not over Erin personally, but over the fear, doubt, and isolation I had carried. Her silence had become my closure, my confirmation that I had survived, I had prevailed. And I had done so with my integrity intact. And as I stepped into the cool evening air, leaving the office behind for the day, I understood fully that some victories aren't defined by confrontation or revenge. They're defined by the quiet reclamation of your own peace and the unwavering knowledge that you stood true when it mattered most.